Hello, History of 20th Century Art class. Today we present to you the movement of abstract expressionism that Group 3 calls the expression of reality by Ana Cervantes, Cassandra Jones, and Marina May. Before I dive into abstract expressionism, it is important to understand how this movement came about. It is important to remember that in the beginning of the 20th century, the center of the art world was Paris. This is a city where great art was made and where great artists like Picasso, Matisse, Monet, Manet, and more studied and worked. During 1939 and 1945, World War II broke out. In 1940, Germans attacked France and quickly defeated the French army. The French government departed Paris and the Germans occupied the city. After the end of the Second World War, people yearned for a new start. They were glad that the war that had left Europe in rubble and ashes was finally over and hoped for a better life in peace and prosperity. During this time, people did not want to be reminded of the horrors of the war. People looked for things to latch onto. Artists like Moholy-Nagy, Mondrian, Duchamp, Dali, and more immigrated to the United States where the war's consequences were least in evidence. In America, before World War II, the Museum of Modern Art opened on 1929 in New York. This museum was privately funded and financed, devoted entirely to modern art. The first exhibit showcases post-impressionism artists Cezanne, Gauguin, Seurat, and Van Gogh. This exhibit only ran for 1 month, but the works attracted thousands of visitors, making the MoMA a cultural destination. The founder, Alfred Barr Jr., intended the museum to be dedicated to helping people understand and enjoy the visual arts of the time. Following the example of the MoMA, 10 years later, the Museum of Non-Objective Art opened on 1939 in Manhattan, New York. The museum today is known as the Solomon Guggenheim. The MoMA and the Solomon Guggenheim became the new artistic metropolis and outranked the artistic city of Paris. As the World War II swept over Europe, New York became the center of art and culture. Once European artists moved to New York, the art scene thrived. During the time of the 1950s, a group of active artists was called the New York School. The art being produced by the New York School was considered avant-garde. These artists that created avant-garde work was innovative, experimental, and challenged accepted boundaries of art. One of the innovations was abstract expressionism. This American movement was influenced by European modernism, surrealism, and non-Western art. Abstract expressionism was the first modernist art movement to originate in the United States. It was a style of art characterized by complete abstraction, generally expressive techniques, and focused on line and color without any attempt at representing literal objects. Abstract expressionists wanted to create art with energy and emotion. They thought this was a way art can be a universal visual experience that anyone can respond to. Abstract expressionism and the New York School ended up having a major influence on all art. These men and women listed are artists I will be focusing on during this presentation. This group largely constituted the first and second generation of abstract expressionists. Even though they worked in several styles and brought different themes to the creative table, these artists exhibited together. They would also meet in studios, bars, cafes to exchange ideas about their pioneering new art form. On May of 1951, it was a gathering of a number of notable artists, the New York School. They opened a show that was deemed a great success. The Ninth Street Show was a historical, groundbreaking exhibit created by Leo Castelli. This show represented the new art in the 20th century. The exhibition featured the work of around 70 artists. From the work of William de Kooning to Jackson Pollock, it is this exhibit that spanned the first generation of abstract expressionists. When the Ninth Street Show opened, there was a line down the street of people wanting to come in. Among the visitors were some of the most influential people in the New York art world: dealers, collectors, critics, and museum directors. Harold Rosenberg and Clement Greenberg were the main critics of modern American art. Even though they differed in their perspective as to why abstract expressionism was important and clashed in their theories, altogether they developed the vocabulary, tools, and content that helped explain the new art movement for the rest of the world to understand. Harold Rosenberg most famously coined the term action painting, believed that abstract expressionism was a departure from modernism and stood firmly by the creative act of artist. He believed abstract expressionism was the artists taking their creative freedom to paint for painting's sake. He believed this brought a high value to the artwork, which represented a pure moment of creation, an act of political, moral, and aesthetic revolution. In his essay, The American Action Painters, he wrote, "The new American painting is not pure art. Since the extrusion of the object was not for the sake of aesthetic, the apples weren't brushed off the table in order to make room for the perfect relations of space and color. They had to do so that nothing would get in the way of the act of painting." Both Rosenberg and Greenberg's theories applied exclusively to painting. While Rosenberg focused on the essential center of the process of action painting, which he asserted captured the artist's spirit and true self, Greenberg focused on the surface and result left on the canvas to digest. Clement Greenberg favored the analyzing of the object versus the biography of the artist. He also felt that abstract expressionism was a continuation to modernism. In his essay, Modernist Painting, Greenberg says, "The essence of modernist painting lies, as I see it, in the use of characteristic methods of a discipline to characterize the discipline itself, not in order to subvert it, but in order to entrench it more firmly in its area of competence." Greenberg praised abstract expressionism art for its ability to bring truth to painting, directly challenging the art of the Enlightenment, which he felt was art that didn't paint reality but more so the ideal. Greenberg had great influence and should not be underestimated. Museums consulted him, artists even sought for his advice, and some changed their painting based on his reaction. In the 1950s, Greenberg's formalism was best represented in the work of artist Jackson Pollock. Abstract expressionism had two different styles: action painting and color field painting. Action painting is a style of painting which paint is spontaneously dribbled, splashed, or smeared onto the canvas, rather than being carefully applied with a brush. Color field is characterized primarily by its use of large fields of flat, solid colors spread across or stained onto the canvas to create areas of unbroken surface and a flat picture plane. The movement places less emphasis on gesture, brushstrokes, and action than abstract expressionism, favoring instead the overall consistency of the form and process, with color itself becoming the subject matter. During the violent climate in world history, there was a major need to offset the controlling stronghold over the arts. That is what the work of abstract expressionist Jackson Pollock did. As Anne Eden Gibson states in her book, Abstract Expressionism, Other Politics, the artist who emerged as essential abstract expressionist hero was Jackson Pollock. At the time, Pollock can be described as the most influential artist in the world because of his mysterious, explosive, tense, and altogether new style of art. His work was indeed new to the time and sparked a wide spectrum of strong feelings from reverence to confusion. The art was confronting to the viewer who had to decide for themselves what the art was, what it meant to them, and how it made them feel. Affected by Surrealism and Picasso, Pollock moved toward a highly abstract art in order to express, rather than illustrate, feelings. His experimentation led to the development of his famous drip technique, in which he energetically dribbled complex linear rhythms of paint onto a big canvas. His vigorous attack on the canvas and intense devotion to the very act of painting led to the term action painting. Pollock's greatness lies in developing one of the most radical abstract styles in the history of modern art, detaching line from color, redefining the categories of drawing and painting, and finding new means to describe pictorial space. Pollock conveyed what he called energy made visible in mural-sized abstract paintings that embodied his psychic state at the moment of their creation. As we look at Pollock's painting, 1. We can see the surface is unsectioned, unified field. The overlapping bundle of paint create dynamic webs that project from the picture plane, creating an illusion of infinite depth. These webs seem to be composed of energy that pushes and pulls the monumental interlacing of the surface. Most of Pollock's works were created on the floor, with the canvas laid flat. In some works you can see his footprints made in the paint, cigarette butts, and bottle caps that fell onto the paint. Pollock thought and the end result wasn't the only thing that mattered, but the process itself was the center focus of painting. Many people believe that the markings are completely random. However, Pollock thought out where different colors needed to be placed and created areas of interest in his work. Another leading abstract expressionist was Lee Krasner. She was one of the only few women in the mainstream of abstract expressionism. Yet, despite her originality and strength as a painter, her work had taken a critical backseat to that of her famous husband, Jackson Pollock. Krasner was influenced by artists of diverse styles, including Picasso, Mondrian, and Surrealist. Krasner's painting, Easter Lilies, was painted in 1956, the year of Pollock's fatal accident. The jagged shapes and bold black lines against the murky greens and ochres purified the composition's dysphoric. Yet, in the midst of all that is harsh are the recognizable contours of lilies, whose bright whites offer a kind of hope. Robert Motherwell was also a member of the New York School and inspired by Surrealist automatism and European modernism. His paintings, prints, and collages feature simple shapes, bold color contrast, and a dynamic balance between restrained and boldly gestural brushstrokes. Motherwell was an accomplished writer and editor, as well as an eloquent speaker. Through his teachings, lectures, and publications, he became an unofficial spokesman and interpreter for the abstract expressionist movement. Motherwell created more than 100 paintings he called elegies for the doomed Spanish Republic. These works featured oval shapes wedged between irregular vertical bands in blacks, white, and brown paint. His series suggested something about fascism and the Spanish Republic, followed by all issues relating to the Spanish Civil War and the loss of democracy. This series could be Motherwell embodying his humanist feelings and his deep sense of loss and mourning and elegy for the tragedies that had taken place in Europe. Dutch-born American painter William de Kooning is another famous gestural painter from the abstract expressionist movement. He attempted to combine the expressiveness of abstract expressionism with recognizable objects. Most of his works are recognizable because they are abstracted figures. De Kooning fused abstraction, figuration, and landscape in various ways throughout many long decades of his career. And he is unceasing journey to find new forms and subjects made his overall output more broad than most of his colleagues. Unlike most of his colleagues, de Kooning never fully abandoned the depiction of the human figure. His paintings of women featured a unique blend of gestural abstraction and figuration. One of de Kooning's famous works is his Woman series. Right now, we are looking at the Woman 1, created from 1950 to 1952. The painting depicts a large-eyed, aggressive woman with a wide, toothy smile and a wild, abstract form. This painting took a long time to paint, and de Kooning worked on it for a number of years. This is evident when you look at the painting, because of the many layers of paint on the canvas. De Kooning would keep removing paint, starting over, and revise it. There is a vigorous paint application and is very gestural. His gestural nature or action of the work is characteristic in abstract expressionism. Clyfford Steele was among the first generation of abstract expressionists who developed a new, profound approach to painting in the years following World War II. Steele was a color field painter, whose work was intense and jagged. His mature pictures employ great fields of color to invoke dramatic conflicts between man and nature taking place on a monumental scale. Steele was a notoriously difficult character who often shunned the New York art world. He resisted most critiques of his artwork and went to exceptional lengths to control how his paintings were sold, collected, and exhibited. Painting 1944 N number 2 created a dynamic relationship between vertical and horizontal forms. The primarily dark palette highlighted the areas of bright color. Steele used a palette knife to apply the thick impasto onto the oversized canvas, resulting in an irregular textured surface. The artist rejected any figurative interpretations of his work, claiming to remove any recognizable imagery. He once said, "I paint only myself, not nature." Steele left his paintings untitled and identified them simply by the year of their creation. Another color field painter, Mark Rothko, immigrated to the United States from Russia in 1913. Like many other artists, as I mentioned, he is also part of the New York School. Rothko used bands of color as the only true means of capturing feeling. Rothko's more surrealist earlier works transform into these large areas of shape and color. His paintings are generally large, usually around 6 to 8 feet in any direction, and the goal was to take up the viewer's entire field of vision. This was a key feeling to emotional reaction to the shape and color. These two paintings best describe the emotional feelings of Rothko during two different times in his life. Number 22 was painted in 1949. Here, Rothko uses a high-key palette with intensely saturated color. The values in number 22 are bold, jaunty, hot, and abrasive. The light values seem to imbue the work with emotion and life. Rothko was developing his signature image of floating rectangles that continues to be his model throughout his life's work. By not referring to any specific visual experience, the high key values of these non-objective works seem to suggest divine spiritual presence. The red band in the middle is reminiscent to a horizon line, but all is aglow and alive. 20 years later, Rothko painted Black and Gray. Rothko suffered depression in later years. His paintings have an expressive of turmoil and the fading spark within. The painting reveals one of the most dramatic and reticent uses of black. Rothko begins to simplify his color fields, stretching his rectangles out to the very edge of the canvas and effectively dividing the surface into two simple fields. Black and gray emerged at the horizon, punctuated by a dull light. This is the last painting Rothko has painted before he took his life in 1970. Helen Frankenheller, was one of the few women artists who was introduced early in her career to major artists such as Jackson Pollock, Franz Kline, and Robert Motherwell, whom she later married. She was influenced by abstract expressionist painting practices, but developed her own distinct approach to style. Frankenthaler invented the soak stain technique, in which she poured turpentine thinned paint into the canvas, producing luminous colors washes that appear to merge with the canvas and deny any hint of three-dimensional illusionism. Her breakthrough gave rise to the movement promoted by the influential art critic Clement Greenberg as the next big thing in American art. Color field painting, marked by airy compositions that celebrated the joys of pure color and gave entirely new look and feel to the surface of her canvas. Frankenthaler's approach was less about extending the inner world of the artist into the outer through gesture, and more about exploring the connection between color and surface. Her translucent veils of color seeped into the fibers of the canvas, softening the edges of her colorful, floating shapes. The discontinuous flowing lines, splotches, and splatters of paint steeped our eyes attuned to the decorative surface. In paintings such as The Bay, the canvas and the image are literally one. Frankenthaler's created this connection between color and surface. Looking at this painting, we can see the soak stain technique by the pooling and the spreading expenses of diluted paint. American sculpture in post-war period is characterized by experimentation with form and material. The artists at this time often incorporated industrial production methods and techniques. Still, other artists began to use assemblage as a means of creating their artwork. By this, they incorporated found objects and other materials onto their work that played with some of the same ideas as Dadaist and Surrealist. A good example of these methods and techniques is looking at artist David Smith's Cubist series. Smith began his career in the 1940s figurative sculpture, but his approach to the art making in the 1950s can be best described as drawing in space with still. His work shifted to cubes and planes of steel arranged in provocative combinations. His signature burnishing imparts a gestural quality similar to that found in abstract expressionism. In the article, Abstract Expressionism, Other Politics, there are many more abstract expressionist heroes that contributed rich works to the movement, but did not receive the attention they deserved. This was largely due to the hetero-masculine standards that catered to the anti-intellectual, action-taking American model of a hero. Through this lens, the themes and physical appearance of abstract expressionism were defined by the white male artist who became the spokesperson, by critics, and by the institutional and private supporters. This deprives the movement of themes such as maternity, domesticity, masculine emotions, and the experience of African American, Jewish, and Native American culture, further limiting it formally by exclusion of more personal works. There is much diversity amongst the abstract expressionist artists that add value to the artistic movement. Through the works of well-known and lesser-known contemporaries such as Romare Bearden, Anne Ryan, Ruth Adams, Ronald Joseph, and Thelma Johnson Street, among so many others. Through these abstract expressionists, we can rethink the definition of abstract expressionism. The abstract expressionists addressed the great questions of human existence. Abstract expressionism had a great impact on both the American and European art scenes during the 1950s. The movement marked the shift of the creative center of modern painting from Paris to New York in the post-war decades. In the course of the 1950s, the movement's followers increasingly followed the lead of the color field painters, and by 1960, its participants had generally drifted away from the highly charged expressiveness of the action painters. By 1960s, The movement's initial effect had been assimilated, yet its methods and proponents remained highly influential in art, affecting profoundly the work of many artists who followed. All the art movements, pop art, minimalism, post-minimalism, and neo-expressionism, would be influenced by abstract expressionism. For the abstract expressionist, understanding the process of painting meant understanding something at the core of the human desire to express oneself. In the end, making the process of painting is essential in Dalver and may have been their major achievement. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have enjoyed Group 3's presentation.